Hi, I'm Greg, lead developer advocate at Hedera Hashgraph, and this is a description of the Hashgraph consensus algorithm.
Cool. Right. So let's start to getting into some of the meat of the algorithm. So we're getting a bit more technical as we progress through these sessions. So what is virtual voting? How does it work, and why is it so good? So virtual voting is a voting-based consensus has the most benefits in terms of security, resistance to attack, and so on. But it's not practical to implement at scale due to its poor scalability. So this voting-based consensus so this is not virtual voting. So don't don't jump to conclusions here. This is what virtual voting is based upon. But Lehman took inspiration from this voting-based consensus algorithm that has existed for 30-something years, which is arguably the best there is, and this is why Lehman picked it. However, it doesn't scale. It has impractical bandwidth requirements. Every node has to send messages to every other node, and it has to wait for confirmations from every other node, and the other nodes might want confirmation that it's received confirmation. The minute you have more than maybe 2 or 3 transactions per second, you're overwhelming the network with more confirmation messages than you are actual transaction messages. So while this on paper is arguably the best consensus algorithm there is, yes, it's just too low throughput to be of any value within the context of Hedera Hashgraph. So virtual voting addresses the drawbacks of a voting-based algorithm. It's fast and efficient while enabling fairness of access, transaction ordering, and finality of consensus. So that's what Hashgraph does, and that's what makes the Hedera public network run, so to speak. So what Lehman did was to take the voting based algorithm and figure a way through gossip to enable nodes to virtually vote, achieving exactly the same result as a voting-based algorithm, but with high throughput and additional advantages such as fairness of access, transaction ordering, and consensus finality. So let's look at what underpins this virtual voting. And gossip about gossip is the first layer, if you want. And this is talking about the history of how nodes have talked to each other. So if we look through an example, Alice, which is the topmost circle on the left-hand side, but also the leftmost vertical line. So Alice is a node, and she has a message, which we call events, and she wants to send it to the network. So she randomly picks a node, and then in this case, it was Dave. And Dave will randomly pick a node, and so will Alice, such that now Bob and Gina are aware of that particular message, and Bob and Gina and Alice and Dave will carry on doing the same, essentially randomly talking about that event to other nodes on the network. So that's just gossip. Okay, this is just saying, there you go, I know something, and this gossip is the same as what you might be familiar within your family or your social network. You tell somebody something, and before you know it, the entire office knows about it, just because people have gossiped, and nodes do the same thing. So it's extremely fast. So let's look at another set of messages here. Bob and Carol both want to send a message or an event. Now, with Hedera Hashgraph, they can do this in parallel. So it's entirely possible for Bob and Carol to send a message at precisely the same time. And they gossip it, and then whoever received it, Frank and Gina, then gossip it themselves, and so on and so forth. And all the messages eventually arrive at their destinations. Now, if you look at the detail of that slide on the left-hand side, you can see that the envelopes have different colors, but they've also arrived at the various nodes, Alice, Bob, Carol, and so on and so forth, at different times. Obviously, the time they've arrived at those different nodes will depend on when they were communicated to them. So the difficulty here, to a certain extent, is that just gossiping doesn't allow you to determine time. So we'll look at how that translates later on through the presentation. So what is gossip about gossip? Well, gossip about gossip is sharing events unknown to each other during gossip. When a node receives an event from another node, it creates a record of when that happened, and then it will not only forward the event onto other nodes, which is a requirement of gossip, it will also gossip out the record it created, specifying when it received the event that it's now passing on. So each event contains two hashes, a hash of the event below it, and the hash of the received event, and it also contains a timestamp. So looking at the sort of graph on the right hand of the slides, I've colored the lines or hashed the lines a little bit. So as well as Ellen, and this is easier to do when you can point at the drawings, so bear with me. As well as Ellen telling Alice of her new event, the thick dotted line. So look for E, so the blue dotted line near the top. Ellen talks to Alice through the thick dotted line. She asks Alice what she knows, and she sends her whatever she knows that Alice doesn't yet know. So Alice gets to know about other events from Carol and Frank. So those are the ones that are attached to the rightmost blue event with the dashed lines going down towards Carol and Ellen. Alice isn't aware of those yet, but in that conversation with Ellen, Ellen tells Alice, I know this from Carol and Frank. And this is the gossip about gossip. Alice then puts those in her graph in the appropriate places. And this is the directed acyclic graph that we talked about earlier. And at the same time, Alice tells Ellen of any events that Ellen doesn't know about, so that Ellen can also fill her own graph with information that she wasn't aware of. And in either cases, or both cases even, they both indicate when they learned of each of the events. So they include those timestamps to say, I heard about this at this particular time. And the two hashes allow recipients of a new event to reconstruct what other nodes know of the transactions within. And this enables the nodes in the network to know what transactions have taken place and when they occurred. Okay? So gossip about gossip is a kind of two-way exchange, and it took me a while to get this. When Alice talks to Ellen, she doesn't just tell Ellen, this is what I know, but she also asks Ellen, what do you know that I don't know, and vice versa. So they exchange all of that information in that short period of time in order to build their own graphs. And this is of significant importance as we move forwards. What this does is that it provides the nodes the knowledge about the transactions for which we seek a consensus order. It's the mechanism by which talking about the history of how nodes have talked to each other enables each node to build up a complete graph. And it is from these two tiers of knowledge that nodes are subsequently able to sort the transactions in a consensus order known as virtual voting. So remember what I said earlier when I talked about some of the other consensus algorithms. A leader is elected, the leader puts things into a transaction block or transactions into a block, and then broadcasts a block for the rest of the nodes on the network to validate those transactions. And thus the blockchain is updated. With Hedera Hashgraph, or with Hashgraph specifically, the nodes, through gossip about gossip, build their own picture, in fact, their identical picture of the Hashgraph. Give or take the last few events, which will eventually sync. At any given time, every node has exactly the same picture in its directed acyclic graph. And what this means is that they can all come together, well, not even come together, they can independently vote on when events have occurred on the network. And they can come to consensus individually, but the mathematics show that they come to consensus identically, albeit separately. So maybe conversely to a miner putting transactions and then sending them over to the network for validation, the nodes have already got all the transactions and they're now validating them by running consensus, and they're coming to consensus together. Not together, independently at roughly the same time, but with exactly the same result. Which is why you could have a node on Mars and it would still work. So how does that work? Well, a round is created. Did I skip a slide? No. A round is created when the supermajority of witnesses can be strongly seen. Rounds enable us to perform calculations much faster, and every node calculates these rounds independently, but gets the same results as all the other nodes every time. So let's look at a little bit more detail behind this. A witness is the first event in a round for a given node. So on the slide here, we have A1, C1, D1, A2, B2. So they're highlighted in red if you can't see them clearly. A, B, C, D is obviously the column, and 1 is the round. So A1 to D1 and A2, B2, etc. And it's perfectly possible for a round not to contain a witness for a given node, and that would be perfectly okay. The algorithm caters for it. So these are witnesses. So they're the first event in a given round. What are famous witnesses? So if we look at B2, highlighted in green, and we will be doing this for every single witness. Not we. We don't have time to go through every single witness, but the algorithm does. If B2 is seen by lots of people in round 3, it's considered famous. So round 3 is the yellow, the event circled in yellow. So if B2 can be seen by lots of people in yellow, so the green one can be seen by lots of people in yellow, then it's deemed, that particular event is deemed famous. So let's take a look at the witnesses in round 3 to determine if they can see B2. And the idea there is that you follow the lines in the graph. So if you start from A3, you can go down to B3, and then you can go to B2. And if you do the same with C3 to D3 to B3 to B2, we can see that B2 is indeed a famous witness. All witness events in round 3 can see B2, so it's a unanimous yes from a famous witness point of view. But the fame isn't confirmed by majority yet. It's only determined by individual events. So we now need to count votes to finally determine if B2 is really famous. And this is done in round 4. Okay? Now remember, every node is doing this in its own kind of bubble. It's received all those events, it's built this graph, and it's now calculating consensus independently of the others. They all come to the same conclusion, and that's what we call virtual voting. So B2 is a famous witness. It's seen by all of the witnesses in round 3. Now, this is a unanimous yes, because that's how this particular picture looks. But the idea is that a majority needs to see the event, not necessarily a unanimous majority. So how would B4 count the votes? So B4 would count the votes by looking at whether it can strongly see A3. And strongly seen depends on, or is determined by being able to see an event through a supermajority of nodes. So that more than 2/3 of the population or stake, as we will see later, can see that particular event. So we're now looking at B4, and we're trying to determine whether it can strongly see A3. And it can, if you follow the red lines and the green lines, you can see that the lines flow through a majority of the nodes. C is not participating, or is not, A3 is not being seen through from B4, but seeing it through A, B, and D constitutes a supermajority. We have more than 2/3. So let's now look at B4, which is the next witness node in round 4. Can it strongly see B3? And the answer is yes. It can see it through A, B, and D. So again, B4 strongly sees B3 as well as A3. Now, let's do the same with C3. Excuse me. And C3 can be seen by B4 again through a supermajority of A, B, and D. So all we're doing here is following the lines in on the graph. And then B4 can strongly see D3 again through A, B, C, and D in this case. So this is not even a supermajority. This is a complete majority, or unanimous, I should say. So B4 sees A3, B3, C3, and D3, which earlier had determined that I think it's A2 or B2 was a famous event. So having done all of that, we can now conclude that B2 is indeed famous after counting all the votes. So having done this now, or the algorithm, having done this same process for all the witness events and a few rounds of voting, it determines which events are famous, the green ones, and which aren't, the blue ones. So it's okay for C2 in this case not to be deemed famous yet. It will eventually happen through additional rounds, and that will eventually resolve itself. But again, every node does this completely independently, and that's what's so special about virtual voting and Hashgraph. So how do we now order transactions? So we've ignored the white events so far. They contain transactions which need to be put into order. So all we've done so far is to look at witness events. So the black event, which is one of the white, was white, but I've kind of made it black for the purpose of the slide, is defined as having a round received of 2. It means that all the famous events in round 2 can see it. So we determined earlier that A2, B3, and D3 are famous events. And they can all see this particular black event in Alice's line. To know its consensus timestamp, we look at the earliest time Alice had an event that could see it, and that would be A2. No, sorry, for Alice it's itself. Then we look at when Dave, what's the earliest time Dave had an event that could see this particular black one, and that would be D2. We do the same for Bob, and that's B2, and Alice, it's its own black event, as I said. And then by taking the median timestamp of all three events, we determine the consensus timestamp of the black event. So we take the median timestamp of A2, of the black event, B2 and D2, and that median timestamp becomes the consensus timestamp for that particular black event. And we do this for every other white event in this particular graph. So that, and the witness events, of course, so that we can then put them in order. Now, median is important here. Median is not average. Median is the one that's nearest the middle of all. So if one particular event, or say D2, had a timestamp which is 3 hours before all the others, its timestamp would essentially be discounted because it's nowhere near the middle of all the other timestamps. Whereas if we took an average, then obviously the timestamp of D3 would pull the time nearer itself because of its relative distance or weight. So the point of median is that you remove all the outliers straight away, and you hone in on kind of the majority that's nearest each other. And that essentially, again, is an important element of this. It means the consensus timestamp is not dependent on the time of a particular node, and if a node's time is completely off, it will not affect consensus. So it's not possible, again, for a node to change the ordering of transactions simply by changing its clock. It will get consistently ignored and therefore has no effect on consensus or transaction ordering. Okay, so we've through this we've been able to agree on who gets to contribute to the calculation, and we've done so in an ABFT manner. Now, looking at proof of stake with proxying, the question is, what defines the network? What defines the 2/3 of the network? And if you remember what I said earlier, in Hashgraph permissions with swells, it's nodes that are counted when we come to virtual voting. With the public network, Hedera Hashgraph, it's not nodes. The nodes are, the node count is arguably irrelevant. What's important is how much they stake. So when a vote takes place, the voting weight is the node's own stake plus what's proxied to it, divided by the total number of H bar, which is 50 billion. So what we see here on the picture is that the node has its own owned coin, which is its own stake. It has also received proxy from a third party, that could be any of us, that have proxied to the node. And the node's total stake when it comes to voting is the sum of its own stake plus what's been proxied to it. Conversely to a private network, with a public network, the node's stake is what weighs its voting in virtual voting. So every node participates in consensus, and the staking model protects the network against Sybil attacks. As I said earlier, if the owner of that particular node was to create another node, in order for that node to vote effectively in consensus, it would have to have some stake. And obviously, the node's owner then has to divide the stake from the first node with the second one, which results in exactly the same voting weight. Remember, that's the node's stake plus the proxy stake divided by the total number of H-bar. And in return for stake, there are payments that are returned to the node, but we'll cover these in crypto economics a bit later on. So, Hashgraph is a consensus algorithm that achieves the gold standard of security with asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerance. It's incredibly fast and bandwidth efficient. It's leaderless. I've mentioned this before, so I won't labor the point. I hope this introduction, or detailed introduction maybe, to virtual voting was useful. There is a video online of Lehman going through more of it. It takes roughly an hour, and he goes into much more detail than I have done.